Hello and welcome back to RPG PhD. I'm Dr. Ben. Picture this. You're 3 sessions into a new campaign. You've got a character that you liked on paper. The build works, the concept is solid. The Game Master seemed excited when you pitched it. But every session you sit down, something feels off. You're going through the motions, rolling dice, saying lines, and at the end of the night you drive home thinking, why don't I care about this character? Many players might assume it's a motivation problem, or the story isn't clicking and the campaign just isn't hitting right. Maybe you feel the other players aren't giving you room. All those might be true, but there's another explanation that goes deeper, and it comes from identity psychology. There are 3 frameworks I want to bring to the table today. Separately, each one gives you a new lens on why you play the characters you play, and together they explain something many players have experienced. The feeling that a character just isn't yours, even when you're the one playing them. So let's get into it. Dan McAdams spent decades studying how people make sense of their own lives. His conclusion, developed across the 1980s and 90s, was that identity isn't a fixed thing you have. It's a story you tell. Specifically, a story you're always in the middle of telling, revising it as you go, with yourself as the main character. McAdams called this the narrative identity. Human beings experience their lives as a plot. Events connect and themes emerge. Things mean something in relation to what came before. They are the moments where things turned, where something was lost, where something was gained. And crucially, there's a sense of direction. The story is going somewhere. McAdams and his colleagues found that the coherence and complexity of someone's narrative identity correlates with psychological well-being. People who construct a clear, meaningful story about who they are tend to be more resilient, adaptive, and capable of forming stable relationships. So, at the table, when a player creates a character, they're opening a new narrative thread. The character has a history, even if it's sketched in a few bullet points. They might have a personal wound or a goal, or a person they're trying to become. From session 1, the player weaves that thread into the larger story at the table. This is why some Game Master moves hit harder than they should. You've seen it. The Game Master introduces a plot development that cuts against something the player established about their character, a threat to the character's story. The revelation that the beloved mentor was corrupt all along, the faction the character built their identity around turning out to be the villains. The backstory element that gets contradicted by new lore. And the player goes quiet or pushes back harder than the situation seems to warrant, or checks out entirely. From the outside, that can look like being precious about your character, or difficulty sharing narrative space, or even a lack of flexibility. What McAdams' framework suggests is something different. The player is protecting a narrative arc. The Game Master's move threatened the coherence of the story the player has been building about who their character is and where they're going. And because we process character identity through the same cognitive machinery we use for our own identity, that threat registers with real psychological weight. It shows up in another way, too. Some players become strangely resistant to character growth itself. The Game Master sets up a perfect redemption beat or a moment where the character's worldview should crack open, and the player deflects it, plays through it, or retreats to the version of the character they arrived with. From the outside, that looks like a player refusing to engage with the story. What's actually happening is that the arc they're protecting runs in a different direction than the one the Game Master is offering. The growth beat feels like a detour, or worse, a hijack. The player might not be avoiding change, instead they might be protecting the specific change that they came to play. Raya is playing a former temple acolyte who left the faith after the church failed her family. Her arc is about building a new kind of devotion earned through action, proven through choices. She's slowly becoming someone who believes again on her own terms. The Game Master, wanting to add complexity, reveals that her old temple has been corrupted by a demon and asks Rhea to go undercover inside to expose the leadership. The Game Master sees an interesting plot, but Rhea's player sees her arc being hijacked. She spent 4 sessions building distance from the faith. Now the story wants her to return to it in service of a mission that she didn't choose. Her narrative thread is being pulled in a direction she didn't set. This is the friction McAdams' theory explains, the player's investment in the story they're authoring. When the table story starts writing over it, conflict might follow. So, for the Game Masters, before a campaign launches, ask your players one question. Where is your character trying to get to? The answer tells you where their narrative thread is pointing. That doesn't mean you have to follow it into every corner of your campaign, but you do need to know it exists. Because every major development you introduce might be landing inside a story that's already in progress. The friction Game Masters read as player stubbornness is often 2 stories colliding without either party having mapped the intersection. When a player pushes back hard on a plot development, the instinct is to read it as a control issue. Ask a prior question first. Did this move cut against the arc they've been building? If it did, the pushback is information. The player is telling you where their investment lives. A Game Master who hears narrative resistance as feedback rather than obstruction builds campaigns that hold people across sessions. In 1986, Hazel, Markus, and Paula Nurius published a paper in the American Psychologist that introduced the concept of possible selves. The argument was this: when people think about identity, they're thinking about who they might become. Markus and Nurius identified 3 categories: the hoped-for self, the version of you you're working toward; the successful self, the loved self, and the capable self; the feared self, the version you're trying to avoid, the failure, the outcast, the person who never amounted to anything; and the expected self, the version you think is actually likely given your circumstances. Motivation, they argued, is largely driven by the gap between these. People work hard when the hoped-for self feels reachable and the feared self feels avoidable. People disengage when the expected self collapses toward the feared one or when the hoped-for self starts to feel out of reach. The theory was influential because it explained something drive theories couldn't: why people with the same external circumstances can have completely different motivational profiles. Rewards alone don't produce sustained effort. What produces sustained effort is whether that future self feels reachable. Players come to the table with possible selves already running. When someone says, "I just want to play someone cool," they're reaching for a hoped-for self. The dashing rogue, the stoic warrior, the brilliant arcane scholar. These archetypes are popular because they map onto versions of ourselves we might find aspirational. We want to spend 3 hours being someone competent, admired, or capable. Someone who gets the dramatic moment right. But the hoped-for self isn't always a flattering mirror. Some players reach for something further out, a self they would never construct in real life: the ruthless assassin, the charismatic manipulator, the warlord who burns the village to save the kingdom. These characters aren't aspirational in any straightforward sense. What they offer is distance, the freedom to try on a value system, a way of moving through the world that real life doesn't permit or might punish too heavily to explore. Markus and Nurius called these possible selves as well. These characters might not be admirable in the same way, but they just have to feel like a version of self worth inhabiting for a few hours. The feared self shows up too, though less often acknowledged. Some players avoid certain character types because those types brush too close to who they're afraid they are or who they might become. The cowardly character who never speaks up, the morally compromised one who keeps making the wrong call. And the expected self appears in how players approach their characters' futures. A player whose real life feels stalled might pour everything into their character's success, chasing the win the expected self can't currently reach. Or they might sabotage it, unconsciously keeping the character's ceiling in line with their own. The expected self is the hardest of the 3 to see clearly, in yourself or at the table. So, as an example, Malik decides to play a disgraced knight trying to rebuild his honor. On paper, this is a rich arc. In play, the game master sets up scenario after scenario where Malik's character is publicly humiliated, stripped of allies, and faced with decisions that have no clean answer. After 6 sessions, Malik goes flat. His choices stop connecting to the character's goals, and he's present but not invested. The hoped-for self his character represented, the knight who earns back his dignity, keeps getting pushed further away. The gap between where the character is and where Malik wanted him to go feels too large. The expected self has collapsed, and he's no longer playing towards something. If the game master had noticed the pattern, they could have introduced a small win, a moment where the knight's choices paid off, something that kept the hoped-for self visible on the horizon. Instead, the arc just ran out of fuel. For game masters, a player building toward a hoped-for self needs the horizon kept visible. They need to feel the destination getting closer, even slowly, even through setbacks. A game master who keeps the hoped-for self permanently out of reach in the name of dramatic tension or realism will find that player has quietly stopped reaching for it. The arc just stops generating forward motion. The feared self is a more delicate instrument. Pressure toward the feared self creates stakes, and stakes, of course, create story. But players need agency over whether the feared self materializes. A game master who drives a character toward their feared self through circumstances the player couldn't have influenced might be removing authorship instead of creating drama. The knight who loses his honor through his own choices might be a tragedy. The knight who loses his honor because the plot required it might be a grievance. Daphna Oyserman's work on identity-based motivation, developed through the 2000s and formalized in a 2009 paper in the Journal of Consumer Psychology, starts with a deceptively simple premise. People don't just act on their goals. They act on goals that feel like theirs. It's an interesting distinction. In standard motivation theory, you have a goal. You value the goal and you pursue it. This research showed that a critical variable was being left out, whether or not the goal felt consistent with the person's social and personal identity. Effort, she found, is allocated based on a question people ask themselves, usually implicitly. Is this what someone like me does? If the goal feels identity congruent, people invest. They persist through difficulty. They interpret obstacles as information and not as signs to stop. If the goal feels identity incongruent, even attractive rewards won't produce sustained effort. The engagement simply doesn't form. This work was particularly focused on educational contexts where students from certain backgrounds were being asked to pursue goals that their community identity marked as not for people like us. But the mechanism generalizes widely. Identity shapes the gateway to motivation. At the table, this might be why that paladin feels hollow after 3 sessions. You built a character with a moral code, clear convictions, a defined sense of justice, a reason to care. And the game master is running a good campaign. The other players are engaged. By every external measure, this should be working. But you sit down each session and feel nothing. What Oyserman's framework asks is, does this character's goals feel like something you would actually pursue? If you're playing a devout holy warrior in the concept of devotion, of submitting to something larger than yourself, or believing without ambiguity is fundamentally foreign to who you are, the character's goals might never fully land. You can play the character and make the right mechanical choices, but the investment might not be there because the character is asking you to care about things that don't register as yours. This is also what explains why some players gravitate toward the same character type across every system and every campaign and at every table. They've found the archetype where the character's goals feel identity congruent. Playing that type, effort feels natural. Playing against it feels like work. It shows up in creative choices also. When a player is identity congruent with their character, they might generate. They might pitch ideas between sessions. They might show up with notes or ask the game master questions about the world that only matter if they're invested. When they're not, the reverse happens. They might respond instead of initiate or wait to be prompted. They engage with the plot when it arrives at them, but don't reach for it. It can look like a passive player or a disengaged one. But what it really is a player whose character is asking them to care about something they fundamentally don't. And no amount of good game mastering fully bridges that gap. So Soren has spent years at the table playing roguish, morally flexible operators. He's good at it. Genuinely good. The kind of player who finds the angle in every social encounter and makes the rest of the table laugh while doing it. When his friend starts a new campaign and the party needs a cleric, Soren steps up, builds the character carefully, thinks through the deity, the doctrine, the backstory. By session 4, he's the quietest person at the table. He heals when prompted and speaks when spoken to in character. He's present, technically, but the version of Soren that usually fills a room has gone somewhere else. Nothing about the campaign explains it. The story is good, the other players are engaged, and the game master is doing everything right. The cleric's identity, the person who follows a higher calling, who finds meaning in service and doctrine, doesn't intersect with how Soren actually sees himself or what he finds worth exploring. He built the character with care and thought, and it still doesn't fit because it isn't about craft. It's about whether the character's goals feel like goals you would actually have. Soren's cleric is asking him to care about devotion, submission to something larger, belief held without irony. Those concepts exist in his world. They just don't live in him. So when it comes time to invest, the motivation has nowhere to anchor. Game masters often diagnose disengagement late and sometimes diagnose it wrong. By the time a player is visibly checked out, the identity misalignment might have been running for several sessions. The early signs are much quieter. A player who responds but doesn't initiate, who engages with combat but goes flat in roleplay, who shows up but stops generating. If you're seeing that pattern in someone who used to be more present, ask whether the character you're engaging in your campaign is actually the character they came to play. So build towards the character's goals. There's a difference between a plot that involves a character and a plot that requires them. When a player's character is identity congruent, they'll engage with nearly anything you put in front of them because the investment is already there. When it isn't, even a well-crafted scenario can land flat. Better encounters don't necessarily fix identity misalignment. Finding out what thread the player actually wanted to pull and getting that thread back into their hands does. So now let's look at some pitfalls for these theories. Mistaking narrative protection for stubbornness. The risk runs in two directions. Players can overprotect their narrative to the point of shutting out the collaborative story. If every game master move that complicates the character's arc gets resisted, you're performing a solo inside a group game. The character's story exists inside a shared story, and those two things have to breathe together. On the Game Master side, the pitfall is ignoring the narrative investment entirely in the name of that's what would happen in the world. The question isn't whether the world's logic is sound. The question is whose narrative is doing the driving in any given moment. A more subtle version of this pitfall is the Game Master who respects narrative investment in principle but keeps forgetting it in practice. They'd never deliberately override a player's arc, but they're building plot without checking or thinking whether it connects to the threads already on the table. The result might be a campaign where the world feels rich and the players feel peripheral. It wasn't intended, it just happened by accumulation. Playing exclusively in the hoped-for self. Building a character who is already the hoped-for self and then refusing to let anything threaten that position is a trap that's easy to walk into, especially with a concept you love. The competence fantasy that can never fail. The beloved character every NPC adores. The wise advisor the party always defers to. That's a snapshot. Characters need the feared self as a pressure point or there's nothing driving the story forward. The rogue is interesting because they might become the person who finally burns every bridge. The knight's honor might matter because it can be lost. If nothing can threaten the hoped-for self has nothing to say. The Game Master version of this pitfall is engineering the table so nobody's feared self ever activates. Every encounter is survivable, every relationship is safe, every moral question has a clean answer. It feels kind, but it can produce flat characters and flat stories. When possible selves collide. This one operates at the table level. Every player arrives with their own hoped-for self, their own feared self, their own expected self. In a healthy campaign, those can coexist, even complement each other. The problem comes when they're pulling in incompatible directions and nobody acknowledges or names it. One player is building toward redemption. Another is playing a character whose arc requires the party to make increasingly dark choices. A third is there for the competence fantasy and finds moral ambiguity actively unpleasant. All three are valid. All three are also pointed at different stories. It might have a possible selves alignment problem, and it won't resolve until it's mapped and understood. Forcing identity incongruent characters as a growth exercise. The well-meaning version of this mistake goes like this. Playing outside your comfort zone makes you a better player, so push yourself to try something unfamiliar. Range is worth developing. The error is treating unfamiliar and identity incongruent as the same thing. Playing a character who is angrier than you are, more cautious, from a completely different background, that's a range. Playing a character whose core goals feel alien to you in a long campaign is a reliable path to disengagement. The better frame is finding the identity congruent thread inside the unfamiliar character. Soren's cleric doesn't click as a devotional figure, but if Soren finds the thread where the cleric is a pragmatist using faith as a lever, suddenly there's something he can actually invest in. The character is still unfamiliar. The goals are now his. Misreading disengagement as a personality problem. This one cuts across all three theories and is probably the pitfall with the highest table cost. When a player goes quiet, stops initiating, gives flat answers in character, the table's instinct might be to read it as attitude. They're checked out, they're not trying, they don't care about the group's story. Sometimes that's true. But a lot of the time, what's actually happening is a narrative arc that got cut off, a hoped-for self that keeps receding, or a character whose goals never felt like theirs to begin with. The fix for actual attitude is a conversation about table expectations. The fix for identity misalignment is a different conversation entirely, one about what the player actually came to play. Applying the wrong fix might make it worse. The player who is already disengaged because their identity investment isn't landing doesn't need to be told to try harder. They need someone to ask what story they actually want to be in. The game master who asked but didn't listen. There's a version of the narrative identity pitfall that's harder to catch because it looks like good practice from the outside. The game master runs a session 0. They ask the players about their characters' arcs. They take notes. Then they build a campaign that engages those arcs the way a checklist gets engaged, touching them periodically without actually building toward them. The player's arc becomes more set dressing than load-bearing structure. Asking the question is the easy part. Letting the answer actually shape the campaign is the discipline. Confusing choice with authorship. A game master can give a player choices at every decision point and still remove their authorship entirely. The test isn't whether the player gets to decide. The test is whether the decisions they make have bearing on whether the feared self materializes. If every path through the scenario converges on the same outcome, the player is steering on a road that only goes one direction. The knight who makes 3 different choices across 3 sessions and loses his honor anyway doesn't experience that as a tragedy. They experience it as inevitability, and inevitability can kill investment faster than almost anything else at the table. Agency means the player's choices actually branch the possible self's outcome. If they don't, the feared self stops being a pressure point and becomes a plot destination, and the player at that point stops being an author. So now let's look at a step-by-step guide for players on how to build a character you actually want to play. 3 sessions in, caring about your character is a choice you already made or didn't. The frameworks above tell you why. This guide is about making that choice deliberately before the campaign launches. Step 1. Find the arc, not just the backstory. Before session 1, identify where your character's story is going. McAdams' research is clear that investment follows direction. A character with a history but no destination is a portrait, and portraits don't generate forward momentum. Write 1 sentence before you sit down at the table. By the end of this campaign, my character will have... The sentence can be wrong. It can change. It needs to exist because it gives your narrative thread somewhere to point. Step 2. Name your hoped-for self explicitly. Picture the destination version of this character, the redeemed soldier, the scholar who finally acts, the rogue who chooses something worth protecting. Markus and Nurius found that motivation flows from the gap between where you are and where you're trying to get to. A player who can't picture the hoped-for self has no gap to move across. The arc stalls before it starts. Step 3. Find the thread you'd actually pull. Oyserman's question is whether the character's goals feel like goals you would actually have. You don't have to share your character's values, but you do need to find somewhere in their goal structure that registers as yours. A thread you can grab and pull with investment. Find it before session 1 because you may not find it at session 6 when the character already feels hollow. Step 4. Tell your game master your arc before the campaign launches. The friction McAdams describes, 2 narrative threads pulling against each other without anyone mapping the collision, is largely preventable. A 5-minute conversation before the campaign starts where you describe the arc you're hoping to play gives your game master something to work with. They may not completely protect your arc, but they can't even consider it if they don't know it's there. Step 5. Check in on your hoped-for self every few sessions. Is the character still moving toward the version you were building toward, or has the expected self collapsed toward the feared one? If it has, that's the conversation to have with the game master. The goal is finding a direction that still carries the same identity weight, even if the arc has shifted from what you originally planned. Arcs shift. What can't shift without killing investment is the horizon. These theorists came to their work through different doors, but they land in the same place. Motivation flows from identity, from the story you're telling about yourself, the self you're building toward, and whether the work in front of you feels like something you would do. And this works at the table as well. So the next time a player checks out, or a character falls flat, or when a player fights a game master harder than the situation seems to warrant, you might now know the reason why. Someone's narrative got cut off, or their hoped-for self got buried, or the character's goals stopped feeling like theirs. Knowing that gives you a place to start. For your homework this week, pick your current character and write that one sentence. By the end of this campaign, my character will. If you already know it, you're already ahead of the curve. If you can't write it, that's worth paying attention to. If this video gave you something to think about, hit that like button, share it with a player or game master who you think would find it useful. Consider subscribing if you haven't, and drop a comment below telling me about your own character journey or what theory you'd like me to bring up to the table next. And as always, thanks for watching. See you next time.